Now, the reason we would see movement into Ukraine is to engage Russian forces where the majority of Russia's combat power is currently located. Russia has moved much of its military into this region to fight against Ukraine, and it makes sense to, while we are hitting command and control nodes in Moscow, to hit their major military muscle movements, which is in Ukraine. So you'd see Western-backed, including the United States, assets moving into Ukraine to assist the Ukrainians in engaging with the Russians in places across the entire front of Ukraine: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, up in Kharkiv, down in Crimea, etc. And then this axis down here with Turkey would largely be help Georgia eject Russia from the Georgian front, as well as, similar to the Eastern Front, just cause chaos, force Russia to deal with the situation over here so they don't lose access to the Black Sea. Mind you, the Black Sea fleet has already been taken care of, so that is kind of moot. But it again forces Russia to decide what's most important: fighting in Ukraine, defending Moscow, defending St. Petersburg, fighting over where Japan landings are happening, or perhaps fighting to keep their territory in Georgia, or to keep from forces coming from Turkey northward. So some may ask about North Korea and Iran becoming involved. Well, South Korea largely could handle North Korea fairly easily. Iran is likely to stay out of it because they're not super tied to Russia. It's more of an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation, but they're also beefing with Russia right now over a lot of things. That being said, Iran probably would stay out because the United States could basically unleash Israel, as well as support from Saudi Arabia could ensure Iran stays put without assisting Russia. Belarus would obviously be involved because we'd have to cross through Belarus in most parts, but Belarus is a pauper army of really 2 active brigades and proves no match for the West. And many Belarusians, frankly, are so disenfranchised by Lukashenko, they may actually help Western forces. So something that is often overlooked during these fights is the lack of operational security, specifically in the communications realm. And the Russians are atrocious at this when it comes to their comms networks, exposing them to constant information intercepts, the Western coalition scooping up information. In fact, there's universities across Europe that are listening in on Russian radio communications bouncing off the atmosphere because they're just not encrypting them well enough. In fact, we actually trained in this situation at the Joint Multinational Readiness Center using U.S. electronic warfare detection systems to pinpoint cell phone usage. And when the enemy's using cell phones, you can single in on where they're located. You can track them. You can then call a fire mission for artillery on them. You can snoop their cell phones as well to get information. And the U.S. got very good at this in Iraq and Afghanistan. Why do you think so many Russian C2 nodes are being destroyed in Ukraine? The U.S. is listening in, pinpoints them, and then hands the info over to Ukraine to do what they do and see fit to do. Now, of the 5 axes, only 2 really deal with large population centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg. I want to highlight something. This is no easy task. This is not me just saying flippantly, oh yeah, we're going to go totally take these easily. This is going to lead to many Western casualties, likely as many in the first 90 days fighting here as took place in the whole of Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm talking about 15,000 coalition troops likely will lose their lives in fights in the first 90 days of trying to take these towns. In addition, Russia will see mammoth casualties, and I think Russia will likely suffer a 100-to-1 all the way up to a 500-to-1 ratio of casualties. 500,000 Russians could die in the first 90 days here. By the 3-month mark, all of Russia's modern weaponry would be expended or destroyed. They would have to start using Soviet relics for armor and artillery, dumb bombs, dumb munitions for artillery, which they use mostly anyways. It's not like they have smart munitions like the U.S. has, such as the Excalibur round. But they would be reverting to basically World War II level tactics fighting against a modern military. The U.S. and European industry here would largely be untouched, while Russia struggles even to upgrade 50-year-old equipment and bring it to the front lines. What Russia does have is millions of people to fight, and even at a 100 or 500-to-1 casualty ratio in favor of a U.S.-led coalition, that shows Russia losing 10 million people over the course of the war. It means that coalition forces could possibly lose 100,000 people in this fight. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a very, very bloody war. Russia lost 27 million people during World War II, and there's nothing indicating that they wouldn't be prepared to lose that many again in this fight. But remember, a sizable portion of Russia's trained active duty forces have been killed or wounded already in Ukraine. NATO has 3.3 million active duty personnel, huge amounts of reserves, National Guard, and the ability to instill drafts to bring a large population to bear upon Russia. Meanwhile, Russia's active duty forces only have about 600,000 remaining, and that is counting some of the additional conscripts that have been moved over into the active forces at this point. All in all, it's clear Russia would lose here. The initial invasion would likely be over in 4 to 6 months. There's not likely to be an insurgency like we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan because of the different cultural mentalities from Moscow, St. Petersburg, and larger groups of Russia relative to what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. What we would see is the rapidity of the U.S. willingness to start a rebuild policy like Japan or Germany after World War II, as long as there's an implementation of a new Russian government that serves the Russian people. And I think once the Russian people saw that, they largely would consider the war over. But I want to make something very clear. This is a utopian view of the war with conventional forces. If the United States and its coalition allies started to threaten St. Petersburg or Moscow in the real world, nuclear weapons would be involved, and that's a hugely different outcome. I still think the United States and its allies comes out on top, but the world would be a vastly different place at that point. And it's so chaotic using nuclear weapons that there's really no point in trying to determine what that looks like. There would really be no winners. There would be what I would call, I guess, victors in the situation, those that survived. And I think the United States and its allies have a better capability of surviving than Russia does. But make no mistake, in a conventional war, the United States and its allies would steamroll Russia. In a nuclear war, there'd still be a win, but it would be a pretty shallow victory for the world.